Many of you know André. André is a man of many different talents and activities. For me, he is primarily a poet, and a very unique poet. Betty Cohen, my friend Betty Cohen, would have called him a oneer. There's nobody quite like André. He brings a diverse and eclectic collection of interests to his poetry, including everything from Gilles Deleuze to Ed Dorn to various science fiction writers, Gene Wolfe especially, and combines them into an absolutely unique experience of poetry. There's nothing like it. And I happen to know that what he's been doing recently, just when you think André couldn't do anything more far out, he figures out how to do something more far out. So I'm really looking forward to hearing his most recent work, which is being published in a magazine that I'm associated with in Toronto. A bunch of young people put it out, called Cough. So, André, let's hear it.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Mike. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for being here, Mike, and let me come in on your coattails. I'm going to read from Work in Progress. My work is a sort of poematic fantasy fiction set on the lost continent of Boughn. It involves an exchange of letters between a woman and a man, wife and husband. She is the navigator on a ship that's lost at sea after a disastrous battle with aliens. Now, aliens, for better or for worse, that's part of the equation here, so bear with me. He is a gambler. He plays a game of cards that uses the major arcana of the tarot deck. The work as a whole is divided into chapters that follows the sequence of the 22 trumps in the tarot deck. So I'm going to read the chapter that corresponds to card number 13, the death card. This is from her then at sea to him on land. I think the luminescence on the horizon, which leads me back to you, continues to recede as we head in its direction, because the fathers of Cohiba, commenting on the Nostromo's passage through the Straits of the Scarlet Sea in Chapter 10, Book 2 of the Pedagogue's Handbook, describe conditions similar to our own given 1, the recent overboard fall into the pelagic omega of Finnegan and Lenigan, Mizuka, Mead, and Fiat from engineering, who jumped into the ocean or pushed each other like Sun Lee and Company, and 2, the gaseous dust cloud of the Yuzaman Nebula in which, quote, the light loves to hide, unquote, as if clothing, unclothing, reclothing itself in successive layers of spiritual cover, yet shrinking nonetheless. Neither Venus's reading of the spit projected by Commander Express onto the first glass ingot inside the cauldron's nestled metal bowls, nor Toramba, the spirit of the keel following the so-called big fart, agrees with me. Thus, we sail ahead toward the light over murmuring waters to a constant ringing of the bells with a feeling of being watched. Here in a morphic field of rubber cylinders floating like tall, alcove-riddled towers in a web of black slime. The deck furniture secured, but the ouzo in the jars polluted with Canaanite seashells. The bluestone anchor encrusted with seaweed and dead moss. The fissure down the mast and the crack along the propeller shaft, sprouting radioactive plant life. The arcade's stained glass melted away, the flagpoles inscribed with flaming letters, the lens out of joint with the light of new stars. Our sights set on absolute point, to which we now theoretically return under the pure stop-and-go movement of a meteor advancing with its tail pointing forward. Stories of gas passed by a whole crew simultaneously are collected in Helicon's pamphlet on ultra-thin borderlines, the logbooks of the Winchester the Essex, the Luxor, the Lindsay, the Uluburun, and the Alert. In our case, however, the black sky and the silver sea had opened the field of Dasein, so the situation was different. Following the alien debacle and our arrival in the Mare Tenebrarum, just after Captain Anna O, cursing in chronic fits beside a dumbfounded Commander Express, had assembled the crew between the third level of the ship's first bottom and the middle level of the middle bottom, above the head and torso of Avon the Poetess, the big fart became manifest through a gas-induced chain reaction of signs. All at once we stood still and started talking fast, until the random moment when the diving bell cracked and the velvet pipeline filtered the sound. The spokes on the omnicycle appeared to spin in reverse, and we found ourselves pacing to and fro, humming in unison, creating a background drone over which could be heard from beyond the quietest room the timbrel, the cymbal, and gong, until the next random moment, when an auxiliary ladder crossed through the air from starboard to port, and some of us stopped while others kept moving, and communications and intelligence put their foreheads to the bulkheads and together dreamed the same dream. By their own account, they dreamed of red dots, like dominoes, mutating under cosmic rays into 13 open hands, then into 9 dancing heads, then into 12 heads on sticks, exchanging kisses. The waves of fear hit only later, because paradoxically, when the signs of past gas subsided, a good measure of calm settled over the ship into the crew's lower elixir, and like others, Maria, Soho, and Greenwich, Marlborough, and Wang, I experienced a tingling in my breasts. My sex felt lusty and wet, while the phalluses of Chauvet and Venus, Sinbad the steward, and Kodak the second mate stood fully erect, a seemingly clear indication that jubilation and self-renewal were in order, as on the Starman or the Satellite of Love in the abandoned gloss to the Censor Almanac. Yet new sensations followed. From the moment the matrix codes in the magic lantern of the depth gauge confronted the crew's generalized sexual arousal with the nomadic, poromechanical spectacle of bottomless abysses opening, closing, reopening across the ocean floor as the ship made its way through random fog clusters of variable densities. The change of mood and weather recalled the abyssal time when New York came into view for the Lancaster II, and the twin figures of smashed tablet and burned manuscript replaced the Azrael-Asmat equation ocean equals lubricant in the catalogue of men. It was the abyssal time in which distress took hold of our souls at the cutting edge of the ship's crystal body, and anxiety kept us on alert before the cryptogenic emergence of new constellations. It was the time of mysterious seething in the tracelessness of the figurehead after the recombination of Van Rubik's half-shadow. The time of the movement that transports being during the dormition of Möbius. It was the multifunctional, abyssal time of sing-along songs for Drella, Youssef, and Madiba, when the struggle between opposing powers in the First Testament of the Old War impaired the ability to traverse incompatible dimensions, and when the lapses, wounds, pains, and rewards after appeasement in the Second Testament of the New War foreclosed undiscovered territories of the New. Finally, inevitably, after emerging from the 21st fog cluster, we beheld starboard side at 3 o'clock, like the Isle of Blessed Wounds in Yak's Passage's torn letters from Manifesto of the Unconscious and Random, a monstrous mound of sea jelly rising from the ocean's surface, as if from the underground depths of a river of light or a lake of fire. Temporarily enlightened by the spectacular event, like us all, Captain Anna O became our model of moderation along the split, schizo-warped axis of the Ephesians, dead to the stings of life and stronger than herself in the game of pleasure relations, while Ringo and Thebes of the Syracuse school immediately theorized about the sea-flower brain or watery eyeball of Supermind as Beljar, and Avon rhapsodized about her legs turned to bone, floating under the arc of millions, and reaching down as long superfeelers into an electromagnetic helical thread of love fuel, that opened the way through an uncanny mode of recirculation back to Malaysia, Mazlum, and Palmyra. The logbook shows that the second mound of sea jelly, turned upside down on its back, appeared portside at 9 o'clock in the spot of time before the ship was again enveloped in a cosmodromic fog cluster, just as Neanderthal shouted, "Something happening here," and Commander Express started spitting in the wind. During the conversation that followed under the penumbra of the fog, Woodstock and Soho, who had witnessed the second mutation of the Silver Sea, discussed with Ringo and Thebes, who had not, the theoretico-poetic significance of what had taken place, namely, whether relative to the soft metal machine of the crew's collective mind, the upside-down seamound, and the long, lifelike coils of silver water that reached up from it and seemed to probe the stars, taken as the mind's complemental subconscious, together with the first seamound as mind's superconscious, functioned alphanumerically either as an analytic or histrionic assemblage, or as an academic composite of both, or as the vectorial white light, white heat of neither. When the fog cluster lifted again, it settled as a blue-red mist above the ship and revealed directly astern, right side up, a third mound of gelatinous water, as massive as the previous two combined, both of which were now gone. According to Mizuka, who was sitting with her head between her knees and her legs in her arms against the bulkhead between the photopolarimeter and the stelae of Tesla and Tlaloc under the boom, this giant mound represented the appearance of the third oceanic dot in an Archean three-dot pattern identified as the renowned philosopher's hieroglyphic monad of unlocalizability, a pattern whose manifestation at sea, Mizuka, her eyes bulging in an early sign of madness, dubbed Plataforma of the Moist Principle. Despite naming the event, however, and opening theoretical access into the heavenly arms of truth, through the love of truth, within a hermeneutics of erosion otherness, her words acted as penetralia to madness in the minds of Meade and Lenigan, Finnegan and Fiat, all of whom, save Fiat, found their short and midterm memory wiped out. In an archetypal instance of synchronicity, when the order was given to accelerate and put maximum distance between ourselves and the giant mound behind us, two more gelatinous mounds surfaced directly ahead, as if reborn side by side from their earlier incarnations, one right side up, the other upside down, with its long coils of water blindly reaching for the sky. So the counter-order was issued to stop the ship immediately, moving the members of engineering to abandon their posts and follow their spiritual call to transformation on the horizon of purity, beyond the gateway of concealment, by taking, quote, a walk on the wild side, unquote, to the alcove of the panel of the close-up, which they no longer remembered was on the forecastle deck until reminded by Fiat, who led the way. As in the great disturbance of Sauve-Ardy, described by Hadron the Circle Drawer, an invisible scythe seemed to slice through the water, which started bubbling all around us, just as the silver coils of the inverted mound reached over and seized the mound beside it, then lifted it in the air completely out of the ocean and turned it upside down, setting the second mound, with its lifelike coils reaching for the stars, on top of the coils of the first. Towering before us, like a Gothic tree of life at the intersection of the control and conception meridians on the ionic grid in Nikon's fund of funds, the double, upside-down, Cutholic phenomenon polluted the art of pleasure in the know-how of Anna O and brought deep dread to the ship. The captain issued the command to veer to starboard and ordered engineering to their stations, but Fiat and Meade, Mizuka and Lenigan, led by Finnegan, scrambling from the forecastle deck in the grip of madness, searched in vain throughout the ship for the engine room, whereupon Scardanelli, Nobodinus and I, like the swift nudes of Anatis, had the presence of mind to act on engineering's behalf and tend to the binnacle magnets, adjust drainage levels on the draft pistons, and secure the cassettes in the cyberspace sockets. We pulled away to starboard, gaining speed as the wind energized the jib, the flying jib, and the spanker. But as we sailed to safer waters, the towering phenomenon from which we escaped and the long shadow it cast mutated. The two sets of watery coils merged and formed a single column of two intertwining strands. At the same time, during the process of mutation, the mass of sea jelly hovering in midair dissolved and continued to shrink, while its image/movement underwent dissemination and transference onto the column's mystical summit. All hands were on deck when the silver waters of the column's twin strands, rising to a height of some 2,000 cubits, portside, behind us, converged to form the simulacrum of a culminating faucet, like the hardware on the thigh of the Goth Colossus, creating the miraculous apparition of a colossal, free-floating faucet running water into the sea. In the visionary fold of that moment, subconscious and superconscious minds came together, and the open call was heard to take a closer look. So we looped back and resumed our course toward the luminescence on the horizon, with the faucet off to port. What could not be foreseen was the change of weather we saw next. A force 11 gust of wind swept in and blew across the faucet's stream, projecting a massive body of water in our direction that kept approaching like a long, sinister cloud, the weather event whose impact was to wreak such havoc with the ship. Amid the ensuing commotion, the order was given to activate the ventilation system, but before the photon fans, the tachyon fans, the trilithon fans, and the pyramidion fans could be engaged, Meade, falling from the belvedere, cried out, "The end of theory!" and plunged into the sea, followed soon after by Finnegan, who took a running jump. Moments later, along the portside bulwarks, Fiat, Mazuka, and Lenigan did the same, jumping overboard, one after the other. Strangely, as if refusing to sink, Lenigan's legs continued to kick in the air, which prompted Cypher, beside me on the quarterdeck by the paddle, to remark that the spectacle seemed an ironic representation of the legs turned to bone dragged below the hull by Avon the poetess, while Chauvet, overcome with emotion, recalled how our lost crewmates, quote, were exquisite, the most youthful and elegant among us, beautiful of body, the sweetness of their thighs, their lips. My love, since I broke off this letter to you, action, adventure, and death have bent and twisted time. We are now stuck here in the shoals with the light finely aligned behind us. Different wave types continue to pound us, no doubt as the direct result of the furious whipping of the sea, projected on the glass ingots by Commander Express and interpreted by Venus from the Spit, then commanded by Anna O. during our second go-around after the accidental thrust of mutiny. Internal waves at 2 and 3 o'clock, quote, rebirths magnetizer, unquote, behind the hallucination of the all-swallowing gate at the edge of night in the introduction to Cosmos by Captain Ursula. Constructive and destructive waves at 4 and 5 o'clock, respectively, both preserving and spending the memory images of comedy and tragedy in the, quote, mat dot chiasmus, unquote, of Eleusis and Isis labyrinth/asylum. Standing waves, alternately at 6 and 12 o'clock, whose silence is final and crisscrossed with oblique, horizontal sounds from the most primitive vibrations of underworld, before, quote, the monster is overcome, unquote, according to Cabu's Tarot Manifesto. Breaking waves at 7 o'clock and progressive waves on the orthogonal axis of 8, where quest, voyage, and return are, quote, sheets of the past in the cone of a fool's cap, unquote, as explained in Dr. Starbuck's treatise on phosphenes. Refracted waves at 9 and or 10 o'clock, instruments of creation for the colored glass shards of the smashed mirror, quote, from the riches of Gloucester to the rags of Machiavel, unquote, in Prosper's chain of spectacles, quoted by Maria from the Adonis view of politics before Maria fell asleep. Maria, whose constrained clockwise path channeled Gulinks, whose bones left a spiral of death glyphs. Maria. Maria. Maria blew out red alert on her sleepwalk. The din of ringing bells that had enveloped us since the storm cloud disaster stopped, and a deep silence stilled the murmuring sea. Then from bow to stern the alarms of red alert went off one by one, just as the distorted voice of Scardinelli from the library blared over the loudspeakers that Maria had fallen asleep and the sleeper was walking. I broke off my letter to you and went to the ambulatory, where I was joined by 2 other women, Thebes and Rosetta. Maria moved forward with indolent grace, as if to showcase her distinctive uniform from the leprosarium at Karnak. A stylish ensemble consisting of small feathered slippers, trousers embroidered in a pattern of lotus and mandrake, a scarf falling over her shoulders, caught up at her waist by a girdle of fretted metal, and a drapery of filmy gauze that veiled her head and throat, through which could be seen her tiny ears, arched eyebrows, and closed eyes. She continued to advance until the moment she arrived at the Bexium tubes and the site of the pinball alarm, where she removed her veil to begin her dance of death. Her slender feet tiptoed through the glass cage, the crypt, and the hall of mirrors, as if to the polyrhythmic sounds of the chime and doorbell alarms. Her sculpted arms seemed ever beckoning and striving to entice to her side death in life, who was fleeing from her allurements, and who she appeared to pursue while walking on air, in a nostalgic reenactment of Floating Dollar emerging from the mists of Bretton Woods. She continued past the waterfall, while other crew members looked on and reached the jars of Special Reserve Ouzo, which has lost its aroma and strikes the palate with a blast of volatile acidity, producing an astringent flavor that turns insipid and lifeless with a raspy, cloying finish. On the foretween deck, where the sound of the doorbell alarm was replaced by the plaintive sound of the time-passing alarm, Maria's attitudes in her dance denoted an overpowering lassitude. As her chest heaved with sighs, her whole being expressed a profound languor, although it was unclear whether the anxiogenous flow of her sighs derived from the pollution of the psychosphere at the limit of commodity, or whether she was expiring of love from the embrace of death in life, the object of her seduction. Eyes closed, her form quivering, the sleepwalker's body undulated while her face remained impassive, and her twinkling feet still moved in their intricate steps toward the Urim Thummim, the gas cylinder, the number 1 lithium mold, and the sound of the descent alarm. Onward to the anticipate alarm, beyond the anticipator mechanism, the diatransmitter, the interval analyzer. To the propeller shaft overgrown with plants, to the melted stained glass of the arcade and the sound of the ascending alarm. Her yearning to bust loose, be free, fly, her will to go, 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 was irreversible. By embracing death in life, she welcomed the infinite acceleration of the infosphere, the financial flow of the micro-traded dollar, the deteriorizing effect of tarot. She invited deregulation, hypercomplexity. She wanted to turn life into repayment of the metaphysical debt she would absolve. Between the swish and swish alarms, in the engine room by the spare propeller shaft, above which Möbius still hangs by her toes in suspended animation, the dancing sleepwalker seemed transported with a delirium of love and passion. She danced as the Boolean embodiment of leper consciousness, as the religious incarnation of suffering in an engine of leper creativity. Open to the enigma of openness, she whirled in a labyrinthine voyage of becoming hanged woman, toward the sound of the digital and electronic alarms by the keel, before the presiding spirit of Sanbonsugi, along non-escapist, sorcerous lines, towards the schizo-strategic plane of pelagic openness, the openness associated with love as the stronger closure of the outside world. To the sound of the boing alarm in the promenade, between the purifier and the trapdoor, her swift movements made the folds of her draperies blur into a social and instinctual body emerging from a field of bodies within the war machine of overhealth, within the hygiene complex of death and taxes, dollarism and tarot, competition, leprosy, clothing. All the crew members who watched Maria's dance of death felt drawn in solidarity toward a reopening of the indefinite, transported by the chaosmic flow of a collective intelligence in which closure remained entangled with impossibility and the exteriority of an outside. Her arms, her feet, her garments reactivated sensuousness in harmony with the rhizomatic exhaustibility of her psychic resources, to a rhythm that invited slowness and withdrawal beyond the frontiers of suffering, at the threshold of freedom's new landscape. To the thrilling sound of the suspense alarm between the luminary and the net, with a symbolic flourish that signaled an insurrectional halt to the disastrous acceleration of semio-inflation across the ship. She came to a pause, placed her feet wide apart, and without bending her knees, swayed her lithe torso downward until her chin touched the deck. Then, as if releasing magnetine streams of meaning and affection, friendship and love, above and against overproduction in the field of attention, against the mathematization of language, her body slowly rose again. And standing tall with ease and grace, she let the embroidered trousers that enveloped her legs fall to the ground and stepped out of her slippers as semi-nude bride in a world made safe for de-automation and poetry. The reference to the chemical marriage of anthropoeme in Laffer's critique of pure mercy was clear. Maria whirled on, while the music of the tritone alarm grew louder and the faces in her audience began to shine. She passed again at the foot of the great spiral stairway, under the tweet alarm, and like Ulinx the Fumist on the stairway of destinies and guide for the dazed and confused, threw herself into a handstand. Her feet rose straight in the air, and holding the archetypal pose of nomad monad, she climbed on her hands up the stairs to the deck, behind the spanker, and arrived motionless in front of the lens. The nape of her neck formed a right angle with the bones of her spine. Her veils fell around her face like a headdress. As she arched her back and angled her pubic triangle toward the malic panel in the alcove, her eyes opened and glowed with radiant sensibility, as if drawing energy from the stars through the lens, while one by one, from signal to signal, the alarms of red alert shut down. Seemingly whisked out from under, by a refrain beyond the noosphere, across a slippery deck, she dropped on her side, dead. At 13.0.0.0.0.0, 15 Solmonat 13 Frigadeg, the end that is not end of Maria's dance of death disseminated her flesh and exposed her skeletal remains. The skeleton's silver bones curled inward, following a clockwise spiral with the skull aligned along the axis of the ship, and proceeded to release a color-O blood stream of smoke as the bones became absorbed and embedded in the main deck's crystal. The skeletal coil began to migrate within the crystal across the length of the ship, giving rise to an Atlantean column of smoke that ascended toward the heavens like the trunk of the world direction tree at the intersection of the red, white, blue, and black rivers in the Baroque prophecies of Cod's poop. The column of smoke seemed to send a signal up to the blue-red mist that still hovered over the ship after our close encounter with the third gelatinous mound of consciousness. It eventually dissipated when the bones came to a stop by the so-called large collapse of the melted arcade. Sinbad the steward, claiming his right to act as public entertainer by virtue of his crossed eyes and crooked teeth, took a deep breath through his nostrils and observed that the distance traveled by the bones from the lens across the deck to the large collapse appeared equal to twice the height of the belvedere from which Meade had jumped into the sea. and 3 times the distance from the lens to the spot near the drainage slopes where Finnegan had jumped. Similarly, he suggested that the distance traveled by the bones measured 4 times the distance from the lens to where Mazuka, in her madness, had tossed herself overboard, and respectively 5 times the distance and 7 times the distance from the lens to where Lenigan and Fiat had plunged over the side. No sooner had Sinbad concluded his observations than he threw his wide-brimmed hat into the sea, and like Master Quicken in the Haldeck, standing with his legs apart, pointing one finger at his rib and the other overhead at the starry black sky, he uttered the percipient remark that the spiral design of Maria's silver bones now ran counterclockwise, which was quickly confirmed. The shift of the remains' orientation from Diesel to Widdershins, like the switch from positive to negative in the red panel hands of Sexy Woman on Nimrod's eve of destruction, divided the crew and, quote, doubled the double talk. Measurements were verified, from the figurehead to the crystal skull rack, from the plumed shell to the domino recess to the Zibonacci chandelier, from the recharging station to the Sacred Heart, the whirling sword, the burning deck. The recurring presence of the vague number and the magic number, occulted in the measurements, and the complex array of mysterious symmetries linked to the death sites for the lost members of engineering, compelled a re-examination of our heading toward the light. Then came a great sign. 7 stars shot across the sky to the melodic sound of New Starway Rundown. Like the charismatic Lady Tongue, whose thick and laughing speech dispelled the winged sphinx's curse over the land between Ixtlan and Eden, Captain Anna O gave the order to turn the ship around. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to introduce Mike, and I actually spoke with André about an introduction because I wanted him to do it, and he said, Henry, what if you just did intros? I mean, I invited the guy, and then I invited myself, so that's an intro. So I thought that was a good intro, but I needed to do more. So, and I didn't want to go out of my office and read over some, I wanted to go down and read some of Mike's Cosmographia, which he sent me a few years back. And in that thin volume, you can find Philip K. Dick and Eric Dolphy careening off one another, and the voice of drummer, Charlie Mingus's drummer, Danny Richmond, saying Razzamatootie. And then, of course, there's a little Dante thrown in for good measure. So we may hear some of that work tonight, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Anyhow, but so what I did is what everybody does so often these days is consult the internet, and found Mike's website through the University of Toronto, and found some interesting things that I didn't know about, and including some great vintage postcards that seem to illustrate the narrative on the website. Mike was born in the home of the parent navel orange tree in Riverside, California in 1946, and I never realized that all those navel oranges came from one tree that actually was a place in North America.
It's almost platonic.
So, and then from Riverside, we sort of got into Vietnam because that's a place Mike didn't want to go at that time, and instead he went to Simon Fraser University in Canada, where he studied with Robin Blazer. And Blazer introduced him to Blake and Pound and HD and William Carlos Williams and Olson and Jack Spicer and Robert Creeley and many others. And he writes in the website that was the defining moment of his life. For the rest of the 70s, he worked varied gigs, finished his BA at Santa Cruz, and moved to Buffalo to join the graduate program at SUNY. He became Robert Creeley's assistant, worked with Jack Clark, helping to publish Intent, a newsletter of talk, thinking, and document. And in '93, he published his dissertation on HD. Moved back to Canada, has 3 children, and is presently working at the University of Toronto. I first met Mike when I was finishing my Charles Olson film, and he wrote one of the best reviews of the film, which I'm grateful for. He was able to see the film for how it was, how it came to be, which wasn't for poets, but was for people who were trying to figure out who Charles Olson was, who had never really read him before. So we're happy to have him as a writer in residence at the GWC, and so please welcome Mike Boughn.
I will, I've been agonizing all day about what to read. So I have a new book called City, and some parts of it that haven't been published yet I'll read to you, but I thought I'd start off with a little bit of Cosmographia, my post-Lucretian faux microepic. Everybody needs a post-Lucretian faux microepic. It begins, as Henry pointed out, with a quote from Danny Richmond. If there's a tutelary spirit to this poem, it would be Charles Mingus. And Danny Richmond, his drummer, in the midst of a song called "Eat That Chicken" on a famous Mingus album called "Oh Yeah," yells out "Razzmatootie," and that becomes the big bang of this poem. It's the opening, and at some point, "Razzmatootie" splits into Raz and Tootie, 2 characters who dance through the poem, exchanging gender identities and personalities as they move along. This is the opening poem. It's called Chicken Pie, Canto 1, Chicken Pie. This poem actually, the book, came to me as I was in an airplane flying over Ezra Pound's grave. I swear, it's absolutely true. And I was reading Flann O'Brien's Third Policeman at the time. And I had the idea for the poem, and the next day we were in some Palladian villa outside Venice, and I wrote out all the books of the poem and all the titles of the poems, and then proceeded to write the poems. And this is Canto 1, Chicken Pie. Can you hear me? Are we good? Surprising voice out of clamor's jelly roll poultry anthem flags an exact moment erupting Tootie begins. How can you say that in Latin when horns and whistles recall from before a precise buried today? Exuberance counters the failure to shed inflicted syntactical devotion in place of pies, where it goes when Tootie, being the substantive declension of Raz, stumbles out of a previous exile of insults into the joy of gravy and thighs. Don't forget thighs, flashing through rhymed proliferation of bangs, intimate further hope. That's Tootie again, intractable, adamant beyond imagination's admirable reflection of receding bang. Big as all get out, further openings seeming to stutter of small pies steaming endlessly. When it comes back reclaiming today, swallows dart through it, still buzzing with Dante's voice, and swart ships, too, light-sodden, air alive with bird-song and goat bells figure a pie, morning cannot surpass in other mornings, and songs of raucous, erectile excitements humming outside the arras, knowing whatever voyeurs lurk in its fold will never get it, especially given Tootie's refrain to the effect you should keep your fingers off the clinamen unless you're ready for the ride. Do people know the clinamen? The clinamen's a Lucretian proposition about what interjects into the laminar flow that precedes creation and causes the disturbance and furor of our world. So I'll read two more of these before I move on. This is called Usual Exchanges, Canto 8. This is from the second book, which is Longitudinal Celestia. Canto 8, Usual Exchanges. This is, every epic has to have a war in it, right? It just so happens that this epic was written during the attack on Iraq. Canto 8, Usual Exchanges, for Ed Dorn. 3 years after George W. Bush Jr. admitted to the world there were no weapons of mass destruction, thus exposing the great lie he had used to unleash uncontrollable bloodletting on a people who founded human civilization, more Americans than ever just stated their belief the war was necessary to eliminate said non-existent weapons. Is this a case of civilization's auto-cannibalistic destiny, some final withering of the flower rooted in Enkidu's seduction, in a vast settling into glazed eyes and inextendable declensions of harmonic vistas, all get up in purple mountains' kick-ass majesty, fluttering diaphanously around Lady Liberty's surgically augmented charms designed to excite maximum national tumescence in really tight jeans? The battle hymn of the Republic was pretty hard too, and onward Christian soldiers caused more swelling than your typical school board was comfortable with, those 7-year-olds exposed to coming operations in inflicted devotions and armed Jesus penetrations within hallowed equestrian intimations could already hear Falling Towers' symphonic ode to democratic missionary position's inevitable viral rendition of Bend Over World, banging around in Sousa modulated regulatory rhythms designed to synchronize boogie apparitions and tutti declensions into simulated gravy unum arrangements of formerly pluribus-tainted wiggle contaminations, multiple pie orgies, and shameless adoration of erupting hoots and jelly roll funk declarations. Okay, now we're going to get serious. I'll do one more of these. This is towards the end. I love this poem. This poem was so much fun. It was really hard to finish. Book 11 is called Demonic Vistas. And this is, I don't know, maybe I'll read this. What's this one? Well, yeah, I'll do. Hoochie Coochie Equivocations. Starts out with a quote from Lucretius. Therefore nature changes all food into living bodies, and from them brings forth all the feelings of animals. Very much in the same way she expands dry sticks into flames and turns them all into fire. De Rerum Natura. There's no way it wouldn't come back to damp evocations of sweet, slapping meat. Stellar bursts of subcutaneous thinking demand it as irrevocable determination of orientation toward tree voices and fluid syllables, sibylline brush with stone. Slap may rhyme with distances necessary for any fallacy to slip from light to light, but entering the difference is only human. If the feather shines, let there be light, and count your less than precise iterations as fortunate interregnums. Getting there is not the point. It's just what happens in spite of perverse proclivities to follow gentle slopes into harbors of uncertain, wet intimacies associated with flammable feelings, translation from comestible. Such a variant geography, the earth given to sensual discriminations and unwarranted deviations into fiery delight, are a constitutional beyond amended petal motivations and hollowed out verbal insulations. Discovering that past the end of the world is a real doozy, leaving personal flotation devices to sink or swim as reveries of Okeanos encounters up the ante in lingering metaphors from previous deviations. The view is tremendous, but confused by uninvited elements, insistent disruption of composition's tendency to rule out homophonic disasters. Dark stars enter the fray, unexpectedly awash in the feelings of animals as they flicker among the thought of sticks and the heart harbored in brittle interiors. Sliding along its breaking, its rising belly of moon-swollen flame is the sudden thinking of its unchained lexicon. You're actually welcome to heckle. So this is the most recent book, City. This is the book one. There's 3 books. It's part of a provocation that occurred when I was reading Charles Olson's poem 143, The Festival Aspect, in which he covers an old Hindu myth about the 3 towns and the way in which the 3 towns were created in order to give a habitation to these demons, who then contracted the 3 towns into one entity and unleashed all kinds of bad things in the world, until Shiva shot an arrow into the towns and separated them again. So the 3 towns became a kind of, well, for Olson, and I think for because of that for me, it became states of, like visionary states, I suppose you could say, in relation to the city. Like, what is the city? So this is book 1. It starts out with these very strange poems. I never written anything like this before. They're like, I now think of them as word clouds out of which the time of the poem precipitates. And it begins with the end, of course. Where else are you going to start except at the end? And this one is, this is called The End. 112, The End. The first poem is called Prelude. We have auguries of the end, later, Armageddon, the endlessly deferred end, the final apocalypse, really, afterwards. This is the end for André Spears. Flames have been in the picture, sporadic but growing. There's no shortage of assholes, God knows, but certain demands in the smog, beyond the diamond, send signals to broken hearts in dismal night, of the last retort indicating other turns of significant, close, patterned, but random import disguised as circling's noose or progress, asks craftily to haul away a nice noun they can hook like you, shattered in such a tasteless sentence, jewels of it grope your mind's irrefragable departures into dreams, twisting into smogged out polis phantasm, configurations of small hearts demanding to know shopping pleasure, who is what and how cultural satisfaction reaches beyond vast collections' well laid out plan, turns left at the second corridor of ease, looking for you are here, landmarks, a red star in the flames, gun on the seat, indicating walls next to the father you have known before, the flames constantly within archival matters, floor plan progress. Maybe it was ineluctably discreet, in which case eternal sidewalk directions are hopeless in anthro-mechanical production lockup. This is the last poem of the book. one of the things that comes up in the course of these poems is a thinking about form and word ending and beginning, and obviously it begins at the end, and God knows where it's going to end. This is the last poem of Book 1, and it's called No Further Adieu. Having reached the end returns godly reminiscences to originary impulses' boundary fetish. Maybe not boundary as breath on neck announces skin. More like a fence through dappled meadow, a real fence, no doubt, but reeking of overripe metaphors. Relief of the end is a kind of meadow and therefore dappled, a state of interruption tumbling out of trees, some of which are oak, birch, and sugar maple, at least in memory. Wind telegraphs it, and edges flutter. Delight, a question best left hanging, a state suspended in light of dappled meadow, which may take tautology to a level of impertinent signals, the kind that lose you or leave you overlooked by the mainstream, which is busy reiterating pre-established cartological conundrums ironically inflected to indicate subtle distances and taste for great literature. If it bids awakening, it remains a silent partner, though the stakes become astronomical, translated into blue light of stars whose distances wheel along boundary. Adieu calls to attention, to hear. That supple shift of weight yields the world in spades. Anyway, it's a place to start infrequent engagements with enormous instances of lapsed terminal nostalgia, thus getting on with it. No further being a prod because certain limits resist easy placement. Returning to delight's surprising instance was ordained by virtue of some difficult-to-define authority often omitted from the list of admissible proclivities. But maybe further interrupts it, leaves it behind, and delight is cut loose. Maybe no further's boundary leaves adieu in the dust of a passage delight claims to have elaborated in clear flutters signaling another city, not so much beyond as within, the way a dream is within the arms of nether, a boundary of such disproportionate nebulosity as to make a bay blush. 5 a.m., July 4th, 2012. And then it is breath on neck, announcing skin, even as the fence continues to demand its dispensations and formations, and the meadow shakes off metaphorical implications and dapples as if life depended on it. I got a couple more for you. Are you all right with that? A couple more?
Yeah. This book 2?
This is book 2. I'm in this writing workshop with Victor Coleman. Victor Coleman runs this writing workshop in Toronto, and all these poems have gone through it's mostly young people, terrific young people. Thank God for young people. And these poems have all gone through it, and as I've finished the books, I make these little books on my computer to hand out to the people in the group. So they're not real books, they're like pretend books. This is from book 2. Let's see. It's actually fun. Like we make these books. Victor and I make these books called they're shuffle off a turn. I've got 3 or 4 of them there to give away actually. So don't go away before you get some of the books. But we make them on the computer and send them out to people. Like you figure you know the 30 people who read your poetry, right? So why not just give them the damn book? Why go through all the process of having to wait for all this bullshit publishing and distribution? And oh God, it's just awful. This is called, I don't know, do you want to hear about the mermaids or the flirtations of light?
Mermaids.
Mermaids?
Yeah, mermaids.
Mermaids arise. So the story is, I'm a dad, and I'm a house dad, and for the last 10 years, 18 years actually, I've been pretty much tied to driving my kid. My wife has the real job, so I drive the kids around, and it's been a constant process of going from karate lessons to hockey games, endless fucking hockey games, to you name it. And so at some point I decided I was not going to be able to sit at my desk and write poems. I was going to have to do it in the arena. So I came up with this plan of writing out all the titles, and then in my notebook, and then wherever I was, I could, write a line here and write a line there. I didn't have to worry about all that stuff. So in the beginning, I was quite rigorous about not changing the titles, but then in this book, I kind of gave up and I've changed the titles. This is a poem whose title changed at some point, and there's some indication of that in the poem. This is 232, Mermaids Arise. When she comes, the mountain quivers with pleasure, and boxes without topses will be a subject of exquisite scholarship. The mermaids, having been declared figmentary by National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, wonder what hit them, but having multiple resources at their fin tips, consider moving to the city to blend in. The mountain, meanwhile, having discovered itself halfway to heaven and recovered its composure, wonders at how shifting titles and revelations yet to come leave behind seismic destinies of less than obvious demarcation. Such is the way of fish and men in elusive reflection of troubled water's rippled face and a sudden church in near distance. The city, disturbed by eruptions of distended ectoplasmic power surges meant to level resistance to announcements from the administration, refuses to go back into the box of non-speculative determinations, reduce elemental bon mots into simple-minded slogans designed to provide faux vegetables to an audience entranced by the sight of stuff glowing behind windows in the night. Leaking radiance is also an event, even under the gray dome. For the sun to become the earth, certain questions with the stress on quest must enter the arena of passion's attention. Transmutation is no mere sleight of hand, more of the eye as it grips down into an earth of unexpectedly rich vocabulary that leaves it strangely speechless. The end of mermaids is a well-known goal of reasonable administrations, dead set on settling once and for all errant spasms of imagination. Really serious violations threaten the very definition of minstrel, leading to diminished expectorations of, figuratively speaking, loose ends. After that, who knows? The next stop may look palatial from outside, but lacking mermaids tends toward tawdry points of cheap, splayed along roads' thoughtless abuse of space. Grime is not just about money, but a poverty of interdimensional feedback breeding pockets of oronic loggerheads and abutments of lifeless seas. They stretch down roads with no terminal satisfaction beyond redemption's siren call, which, though relying on the power of cliché, gets back to mermaids while foretelling after the fact myths of woven night. Having been proven above and beyond all reasonable limitations not to occupy narrow sectors of space, time, stripped of nutrient conjecture, they are left to move on to more interesting critics and conjuries of terrors that slip the leash of actuarial inventions, risk-free as far as predictable liability goes, but not so hot when eyes of fire enter the equation, throwing ontic seizures around, objective contents, and stirring up metaphysical shit with So-Shoe's fabled pole. The attraction of the city toward elements of questionable repute will always find a way into its face, even pink with the flush of sunrise. Mermaids, no. Reading it over and over in multiple registers as they pass from water to air, air to water, thinking idly of further passages with the mountain beyond the ninth sphere.
Yeah.
And then there's a great picture of mermaids. One more, I'll do one more. This is from book 3. Yeah, it's almost done. Today I finished a poem here.
Today you did?
I did today, yeah, so there's like a couple more to go. Well, okay, I'll read this last. This is book 3, part 2, on the 6th poem. So this is the last poem in part 2 of book 3. It's called Luminous Irritants. And it also has an epigraph at the beginning from Pliny. Is it Pliny? Pliny the Elder? Pliny?
Yeah.
Pliny the Elder. Natural history. The wiser people boil the water down to 2/3, add 1/3 of old honey, and let the mixture stand in the sun for 40 days at the time of the early rising of Sirius. So dogs got into the poem. Well, cows got into those poems, right? In this book, the cows wander through the poem and become a kind of active force.
Those are the dog days.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Well, so what happened was this actually, maybe I should read the other poem. This coyote got into the poem. Maybe I'll read
Coyote?
a coyote, yeah. Well, maybe I'll read that one. This is 323. It's called Another Nice Gesture of Epiphany for Curtis. I'll explain Curtis at the end. It just breaks my heart that she was taken from us like that, she said of her Yorkie, snatched by a coyote while relieving itself in the family's backyard. It's just not how it should be in the city. Sorry. Am I perverse? I just found that absolutely hilarious.
Can you read that again?
Yeah. This is a quote from the Toronto Star. It just breaks my heart that she was taken from us like that, she said of her Yorkie, snatched by a coyote while relieving itself in the family's backyard. It's just not how it should be in the city. It is not the beginning anymore, though the beginning always knows the designation may change once the onset leaves registers of intent in an uproar. The third town is now here, or at least close enough to know the difference of increments. Firmaments are overrated when the whole thing comes down to a quarter of an inch this way or that. Look at this form that is never more nor less than a grace of increments and a line of immaculate inquiry leading to adventures time never saw coming. Every day begins before, finishes after, moment awakens to trajections, increments of surprise. City is stunned by the view behind, offers and wants to bathe in light if only light is willing. It comes down to beginning no longer being down, but being here. Followed, of course, by functionaries. Days of wine and rancorous bozos distilled mania fade into token adjustments that fail incremental dispositions possible jump into dimensional expansion, dragging the third town into untenable, if not downright obscene positions in various stellar arrays. City endures material analogies' death grip on the throat of whatever song tries to rise, but turns into metaphorical displays of well-mannered, often clever vectors, leave market a twitter with potential prize-winning affirmations of success. Somewhere to the north, migration grinds to a halt and a new epiphany blooms. If you call it unspeakable, are implications bearable? Or does asphalt sock hold against subterranean pressures looking for an opening? Avoiding easy departures into Neverland's perfect arrangement of plastic pirates and mermaids is the first order. But real fishermen have been known to violate extreme prodigality and leave it bleeding on the pool table. The unspeakable girl drowns in shadow till the third town steps in when an enormous blow opens its prospects to vistas intricately misted, suggestions of cities, streets in February's steel morning, with just a hint of heaven. Coyote wanders the edge of manifold hungers in and out of light, knows a tasty bite when it sees one. Too many corresponding registers of story leave city staggering, but its measure was never meant to equal Coyote's stochastic indication of myth eruption in the backyard. The unspeakable girl is there too, and behind the western sun, who has yet to utter the name of its arrival as a vector field into the gathering vapors of morning. They can no longer keep track of what hasn't happened to conspicuous manifestations, resistance to comfort zones, desperate exclusions. Coyote loves that. Snacks prance in well-lit, manicured arenas of slaughter. The third town looks on as flows begin to emerge from uproars, muttering merciless interference, patterns play across face of cities entangled ifs, and riotous bursts of incremental enthusiasm for wild incursions into its heart.
Great.
So I'll just tell you, I read that poem in the workshop, and one of the young guys goes, "I knew that dog. His name was Curtis."